I'm so delighted to see so many people here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as the case may be. I'm very grateful that you joined me for this class. And for some of it, I'm just going to be talking, as is often the case in these classes. But in some cases, I'm going to ask you to contribute your thoughts in the chat so that we can all reflect on those. And if possible, if there's time toward the end, I'm going to ask you to do some reflective writing, which you can do or not do as you choose, of course. But if you choose to do it, it might be handy, helpful to have pen and paper handy, or you could use your computer, of course, whatever you'd like. But there will be some reflection that I hope, as a result of the learning that we do, that you might write down and be able to reflect on later. So I want to begin, unfortunately, it's often cheesy in these circumstances, with a kind of a joke. The joke was told by David Foster Wallace, the late lamented author, at a commencement speech he gave at Kenyon College in 2005. He told the following joke. He talks about two young fish who've gotten up for the day and are swimming around, and as they swim out toward a shoal to see if they can find some breakfast, an older fish passes them going the other way, and he says, "Good morning, fellas, how's the water?" And they just sort of look at him and nod, and as he goes by, one of the younger fish turns to the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" The point, of course, being that a lot of times we're so immersed in something we don't even realize that we are immersed in it. And for Jewish people, especially at this time of year, we're immersed as a culture in the task of getting ready to remember and in sharpening and realigning our memory. It's part of the sacred task of tshuva, of returning, that happens at this time of year. And so I want to talk with you today, and if you are so inclined, again next week, about Rosh Hashanah is a day of remembering. So its most ancient name, really referred to in both the Talmud and in prayer books, is Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Memory. Of course, there's now a secular holiday that recognizes the remembrance of victims of the Holocaust, and it's right before Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and that day of remembrance, not only of victims of the Holocaust, but of victims of wars prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, is Yom HaZikaron. That happens generally in April on the Gregorian calendar, but Rosh Hashanah was originally known as Yom HaZikaron. And so I want to explore what it is we're supposed to remember and how it is that we're supposed to remember. And we're going to talk about that both this week and next. But prior to me talking about it with you, I wondered if you could enter into chat how you would define or how you think about memory. Just tell me what it is to you, what it means to you, how you define it in a couple of words if you can. And I'll look at these as they go by, and we'll talk about them a little bit. So how would you define memory? What is remembering? Good. Melody says recollection. Ken says reliving. Rachel notes that memory is not reliable. Robert says it's the core of human identity. Chamit Shemeg Pashtan, I think that says. Remembering my life. It's individual and it's collective, Natanya says. Right, Steve's in the Hebrew keyboard. I wondered why I couldn't realize that until I realized there was a final nun in the middle of the word. Who I am based on experiences, a mental record. Steve says joy and pain. That's very interesting. So these are all true, all accurate depictions. Chaya Liora says remembering where we came from. Lador Vador, Raymond says generation to generation. So you can see the sort of wide array of how we talk about and how we think about memory. And I want to suggest to you that one of the ways we have to begin to explore memory is to look at the Hebrew roots of some of the most commonly used words for memory, and then sort of move from there through briefly a couple of other languages. I want to talk briefly about the German and English words for memory, and then into a deeper consideration of how we're asked and what we're asked to remember at this time of year. My plan is that next week we're going to talk about how God remembers. What does it mean for an omniscient, omnipresent divine being to remember? Does that mean that God can forget? Or does it mean something different? Since we're in the image of God, does how we remember reflect in some way on what God remembers? Then on the day of Rosh Hashanah itself, we're going to sort of weave those together, and we're going to talk about human and divine mutual mindfulness, how we're called upon on this day, on these days, to keep each other in mind and realign our understandings of each other. So, Rivka notes that the root zecher means mindfulness, and that is one of the things it means. But the root zayin kaf resh appears in Torah 169 times. It's clearly a super important word. And its primary meanings, at least according to the Jastrow Dictionary of Biblical and Rabbinic Hebrew, among its primary meanings are to remember, of course, to mention, to celebrate, to recollect, or be mindful of. There's another root that's really important that we may talk about a little bit next week, and that's Pei Kuf Resh, which is often used by God in reference to women, and especially women who are bearing and seeking to be able to bear children. And when God remembers them using that root pakad, he sort of visits them and encourages the process of fertilization. So it includes a multiplicity of meanings, including to visit, which is kind of a euphemism. It's kind of a conjugal visit. I don't mean to be flip about it, but that's really in a way what it is. But it's also to remember or to decree upon. So when God remembers, and again, we'll talk about this more next week, God is not just thinking about something, God is making something happen. And since we're made in the divine image, that's something that's going to be really important to keep in mind. So memory in Jewish tradition is inflected by language and by culture and by history. And it's fortified through religious and social traditions, but it's also inflected by differences in culture and geography and language. So we have to keep all those things in mind when we're going through the task of thinking about memory. So now I want to talk briefly about German words for memory. Why? Well, partly because in my studies, some of the great scholars of thinking about collective memory are German. The idea of collective memory in German academia became especially relevant and loaded after World War II, when German society and German academia turned its attention resolutely, in most instances, toward considering how to accommodate the atrocities of the Nazi regime into the German understanding of collective identity. But then some scholars, including the Egyptologist Jan Assmann, started thinking about memory in the ancient world. Because he was an Egyptologist, he took a lot of the disciplines of thinking about what memory is to Egyptian and later Israelite society, and thinking about what it meant to create a collective memory and how that happened. So in German, there are a couple of keywords that show the different ways that a language can think about memory. One is Gedächtnis, which is a word for sort of the thing that gets retrieved, the bit or byte of memory that we think about. But Erinnerung is the process of remembering, the ability to recall evocatively, not just data, but sensations and impressions. A third word that's used in technology is Speicher. That just means data. That just means like the silo where the data is put. And oftentimes in English, we've really got relatively few words for memory. We have recollection, and you used many of the others in the chat, and remembering, which just means reconstituting. I was a little confused about this actually. So I went to look up memory, not in a dictionary. I got a little bit lazy and just Googled memory definition. So I looked it up and online, and the definitions were kind of tautological. That is, they referred to the word memory itself to define the word memory. So one definition was the faculty by which the mind stores and remembers information. So that's memory. It's the faculty that we use. And we, in terms of how we draw things from the remembered past. So the thing remembered can be a memory, but the larger thing, memory, is the faculty that we use to pull something up. So then what does the verb to remember mean? And it means to have in or be able to bring to mind an awareness of someone or something that one has seen, known, or experienced in the past. So that's getting closer to the way that we tend to think about memory. So it's interesting to just have all these out in the environment while we now go to think about memory. And I'm going to now, let's see if I can share my screen, because I'm going to put up the study sheet that I want us to be able to look at together. So this is session 1, Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Remembering. I've pulled in some biblical and some liturgical texts that talk about memory so that we can see the different ways that memory is deployed, used, and defined, so that we can think about what it is that we're bidden to remember. Also, since you and I are going to get sick of hearing my voice, I would love it if I could get a volunteer, and Julie will need to be able to unmute. People will need to be able to unmute just to be sure. I'd love to be able to get a volunteer to read the English. So this is from the Sidur Ashkenaz, the weekday Shacharit service, preparatory prayers, and this is about the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, or at least that's its name. So Lana raised her hand. Awesome, Lana. If you could, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Lana.
Yep, straight from Toronto. Straight from Toronto.
Awesome. Welcome, welcome. So if
Thank
you could read this where it begins, Master of the World, that would be great.
Master of the world, may it be your will, Lord our God and God of our fathers, to remember in our favor the covenant of our fathers. Even as Abraham our father held back his compassion from his only son and desired to slay him in order to do your will, so may your mercy hold back your anger from us. Let your compassion prevail over your acts of retaliation.
Slay him to do your will.
If everyone else could mute, that would be great. Thank you.
Be lenient with us, Lord our God, and deal with us kindly and mercifully. In your great goodness, may your fierce wrath turn away from your people, your city, your land, and your heritage. Fulfill, Lord our God, what you promised us through Moses, your servant, as it is said, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, also my covenant with Isaac and my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land.
Beautiful, Anna. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to scroll back up a little bit so that you can see that the root of zikaron, zecher, appears, where it appears in the Hebrew text, So whether or not you read Hebrew or how well you read it, you can see where it's important. So here, I just want to say a couple of things about this. Remembering here involves something called zchut avot, the merit of the ancestors. So when people ask God to remember, they are not only asking God to remember the merit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they are actually when we ask God to remember, we are asking God to imitate us. Imitation and repetition are super important in biblical aspects of memory. So, but this is kind of a shocking and surprising idea that we may be made in the image of God, but frequently what we do and what we ask God to do at this time of year is for God to imitate the best in us. So in other words, and leaving aside for now the very difficult questions of what goes on in the binding of Isaac. We're going to spend, I hope, more time on that next week because it's so important to Rosh Hashanah. Leaving aside the difficult theological questions that come up, what's remarkable here is that in the weekday prayers, every single day, we come across the idea that God should imitate Abraham, that the divine should mimic the best of the human, so that even as Abraham, unwilling to turn left or right, forced with what he interprets to be a divine decree to slaughter his beloved son, goes right up to the edge until God and or the angel of God stop him. So we want God to be able to remember, that is, in a sense, mimic Abraham and do what Abraham did, which is, despite enormous pressure, enormous desire to step back from the brink of judgment and harsh action and do for us what Abraham was willing to do for God, which was to step back from the brink of a divine decree. I also want to include something from the Machzor Sfarad, the Sephardic prayer book for Rosh Hashanah. Does somebody else want to read this in English, where it begins, "Blessed are you, eternal our God"? If somebody raises their hand using the little raise hand action that you have at the bottom of your screen, I will call on you.
Or if you don't know where to find that, you can put in the chat that you'd like to read.
It looks like Ellen raised her hand. So Ellen, thank you for bravely volunteering. Could you read this?
Blessed are you, eternal God, sovereign of time and space, who chose us from every people and exalted us from every tongue and sanctified us in God's folk. And gives eternal God in love this day of remembrance, a day of calling, a sacred occasion, a memorial to the exodus from Egypt. For you chose us and sanctified us from all the peoples, and your word is true and extend forever. Blessed you, eternal, sovereign over the whole earth. Sanctify Israel and the day of remembrance.
Thank you so much. So, so here, a zikaron is a memorial. In other words, on Rosh Hashanah, among the things that we are commemorating are the creation of the world, the binding of Isaac, and the exodus from Egypt. In this particular case, that's what we're talking about. So a zikaron here is a memorial, an act of calling forth a recollection, an evocation of an additional paradigm-shattering event. You'll note that lots of times this root, Zayin Kaf Resh, is about a crisis, a breaking open, a rupture from normal patterns of living. that turn things in a radically new direction. That's what Rosh Hashanah is. That's part of the reason it's the day of remembering, is that we are called together in community, which this year obviously is going to be very, very different, and asked to realign ourselves and with God. I'll talk more about the realignment of self toward the end of our time together. So this memorial to the Exodus from Egypt is about one of those ruptures. We want to go back to the moment of human divine union, of revelation, of collective consecration of peoplehood in the most dramatic terms possible, and setting up in our minds a kind of standing stone, as it were, metaphorically, to build in that kind of memory. Now here, I wanted to include the text, one of the earliest mentions of the root, where God remembers a woman in this particular way. And it says, V'Hashem pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar, v'ya'as Hashem l'Sarah ka'asher diber. The Lord took note, it's translated here, but it's kind of remembered. The Lord did a remarkable, memorable action for Sarah as he had promised, and he did for her as he had spoken. This kind of memory is a different but no less significant kind of memory. So next week, one of our tasks is going to be to talk about people who are, for whatever reason, exiled from memory. And in the story of Binding of Isaac, Sarah gets short shrift. The rabbis are concerned about this. They're worried about this. They infer from the text, because the beginning of the next chapter, the next Torah portion, is the death of Sarah. They think that the news of the Binding of Isaac basically causes her to die. And they're concerned about this. And the mindfulness that God gives to women has to be contrasted with how we are forced to remember breaks in the text, sudden absences in the text, and the people who are excluded from memory. Here's another text that I'd love to get someone else to read, because here we have a kind of memory that involves blotting out. It's memory as a kind of forgetting. So one thing that we have to do when we remember is choose what we're going to remember and then actively forget other things. Melody, thank you so much for raising your hand. If you would read this, that would be great.
But Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set. And Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nisi. He said it means hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages.
We're going to have, thank you very much, beautifully read. We're going to see, if we have time, a little more about Amalek later, and remembering as forgetting. The important thing here is that this can't just be told to Joshua. This has to be read to Joshua. The inscribing and reading, nonetheless, include an element of forgetting. It almost seems counterintuitive, but with Amalek uniquely, we have the commandment to remember to forget. And in fact, on the day of remembrance, Yom HaZikaron, Rosh Hashanah, we're asking God to remember to forget. One of the kinds of memory that we're asking God to engage in is to remember to forget our trespasses, our sins. Chet, the word for sin in Hebrew, literally means to miss the mark. Every year we know we're going to miss the mark, so every year we say, if we go to Shul, the exact same prayers. And one of the prayers, one of the things that we repeat throughout the day and throughout Yom Kippur is asking God to forgive, which is a way of asking to remember to forget. And it involves reading. So here, God is asking that Amalek be forgotten, but that Joshua, who's going to be his successor, has it read to him. Just on a slight aside, one of the experiences that we're suffering from this year is that we can't be in community, physically in community. Now, at more than almost any other time, with the possible exception of Pesach, when we're gathered around a table together, for many of us, not being able to physically be in community is difficult. One of the things we do when in community is that we read and recite in community. These are forms of creation of memory. And Moses sets this precedent with Joshua by saying the document is going to be a reminder, but it's going to be read to Joshua. This is because the act of hearing and listening is supremely important in Israelite and later Jewish religion. The root shin mem ayin, Shema, is used 92 times. In just the book of Deuteronomy, Moses gives his ethical will in the book of Deuteronomy. It's basically a book of memory. Deuteronomy means second telling. So that's one of the whole book is a recitation and a remembering of everything that's gone on. And so the memory that's being created for Joshua is going in through his ears, even though he's been there the whole time. This is a new level of remembering. So whatever we do on Rosh Hashanah, it has to involve not just listening, but deep listening and hearing. And when we are with each other in communities, we have to try to hear and listen as deeply as possible, especially at this time of year. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this one, and we're going to go to Rashi on Leviticus. I'm going to read this one. There shall be unto you a zikaron of sounding the cornet, a mention. That's how it's translated here, but it could be a memorialization of biblical verses which speak of the divine remembrance, and biblical verses which have reference to the blowing of the shofar on the occasion of important historical events, that I, meaning God, may recall to memory for you the binding of Isaac, in whose stead a ram was offered. So Rashi, the great medieval French exegete, is interpreting here this verse in Leviticus that is making the connection between deep hearing of a certain kind of the shofar with the memory of the binding of Isaac. These two things are part of the reason that we are called to remember the binding of Isaac, is it is the substitution of the ram for Isaac, the ram that gets caught by its horns in the thicket, that the sacred substitution is made of the ram for the favorite son. This act of substitution becomes the basis for all of Israelite ritual sacrifice. And it becomes the basis on which the covenant is firmly established, because it is after Abraham begins this and then desists that God says, now that you've done this thing, and what this thing is we'll talk about next week, now that you've done this thing, because we don't know if it's being willing to raise the knife or desisting, really, now that you've done this thing, I'm going to make you as numerous as the sands on the seashores. Your descendants will seize the gates of their foes. Finally, after the number of tests that God has put Abraham through, this seals the deal. And this is partly reminded to us, blasted into us by the shofar. Now, I want to look very quickly at the 6 remembrances in this Siddur. We're asked to remember 6 things. Now, again, this is the weekday Siddur, but I want to look at these quickly because they're all wound in to the kind of practice that we do on Rosh Hashanah. First, and we saw this earlier, remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt, as long as you live. Here, the word used for remember is hodatam. So that's like the hodia, which is to thank, is the same verb used for thanks, todah, but it's also for knowing. So the verbs for thanking and knowing are intimately connected. And this is important because we're asked not just to remember the whole Exodus or the giving of Torah at Sinai. What we're being asked here to remember is the departure, the day of departure from the land of Egypt, the moment when the customary order of oppression and bondage broke open. Memory also means to tell, to repeat, to make known. That's what it means here in the second remembrance. Take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously so that you don't forget the things you saw with your own eyes. Again, this is Moses. This is taken from Deuteronomy. Moses telling people not to forget what they've seen. I'm going to step out on a limb a little bit maybe and say that in Israelite and later Jewish ontology, hearing is the primary sense, not sight, but hearing. So being asked not to forget and then to recite is because hearing is seen as more reliable than sight. We shouldn't forget that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Israelite culture and learning were primarily oral in nature. O-R-A-L and A-U-R-A-L. That is, verses were spoken, recited, memorized, performed, as it were. So something that was told was more reliable than something that was seen. This also says second remembrance. I couldn't change the number to third when I pulled up the source, but this is the third one. Now this is the second thing that we have to remark on about Amalek, and this is where it is explicit that forgetting is part of remembering. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. And at the end it says, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Zecher Amalek mitachat hashemayim. So it says, Timche et zecher Amalek mitachat hashemayim. Blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. Lo tishkach. So it doesn't just say, remember, it says, do not forget. There many times, as you know, things are repeated in Torah, in Tanakh, in Psalms. There's a doubling, but the repetition is not quite the same as the original expression. And that is because no repetition is exactly the same as the first thing, and we have to finally adjust and further define what something means. Remembering must include not forgetting, and blotting out must include an element of remembering. Ironically, on Rosh Hashanah, we are asking God to remember to forget, and we should ask that of ourselves, toward ourselves, and we should ask that of each other for the sake of our community. I just want to tell a really brief anecdote that almost has nothing to do with anything, but I think you'll get why I'm telling it. At least I hope you will. So, and I'm going to stop sharing just for a minute so I can see you all again. So the other day, my wife and I were taking a walk along the lakeshore. There are a lot. We live right next to Lake Michigan in Chicago. There's a public park that goes along the lake. We get up very early and walk so that we can try to avoid all the people that come out later, just because you don't want to be around a lot of people right now. We're walking along a public path in the park, and there was a woman with her teacher doing yoga on the sidewalk. So we skirted around her, and we walked further on, and we got a little ways further, and we heard the woman who was being instructed say, excuse me, do you know what 6 feet is? And my wife and I looked at each other and we were like, is she talking to us? Excuse me, we turned around. Yes, you, do you know what 6 feet is? So when somebody confronts you like that, all sorts of things go through your mind. And I was thinking about this class and I was like, I want to remember to forget this incident. I want to remember to forget this woman, But I also want to remember that this is a time that's so fraught. Anytime we're in public, we're so concerned about our personal space. Okay, so she was doing yoga on a sidewalk. I almost said to her, yes, 6 feet is 72 inches. Now it's my turn. Do you know what a sidewalk is? I mean, I thought of all these things, but I didn't want to do it because this is a time for forgiveness. And I tried to see it from her point of view. And I thought, this woman is stressed out. These are terrible times. Physical space is fraught. So I want to remember to forget this. I'm not saying she's Amalek. I'm not going to blot out her name from under heaven. But this is a time of year when, and a time in our lives, when forgiveness is super important. So I just wanted to tell that story because I think one thing we are being called to do is not only ask for forgiveness, but to, from God, if we are so inclined, but to seek forgiveness and to extend the benefit of doubt to as many people as we possibly can. And I understand it's difficult right now. In the United States and in other places in the world, the political world is very fraught. There are people we don't want to give the benefit of the doubt to. This is precisely the time when we're challenged to do that, to remember the opportunities that we have been extended, the benefits of doubt, the kindnesses, but also on those rare occasions, we have to remember to forget certain instances, certain people. We can't divorce these texts and these holidays from what we're going through right now. I'm not telling you what to do or how to do it other than to say, deeply reflect on what you wish to remember about this time and what you wish to forget, not only in the grand sweep of history, but in your own personal life, about your own personal self, and about your own relationships. This is the time when the stars are aligned to help us do this work. So I want to encourage you to be able to do that work. We're going to say a little bit more about that at the very end, which is fast approaching. The next thing we're to remember is how we pissed God off. Not to forget how we provoked God to anger in the wilderness, which the Israelites did numerous times. But in this chapter in Deuteronomy, Moses is speaking specifically about the incident of the golden calf. Now, I want us to think about this in very personal terms for ourselves as well, because we provoke God when we are in our own personal wildernesses. That is, when our backs are up against the wall, when we feel that providence of whatever kind we believe in has been taken away from us, when we feel that life is unfair. When we're in the wilderness, it takes a great deal of discipline not to curse the fates, not to curse God. And we are called upon to remember and never forget our propensity to do that. The next thing we're called upon to remember in these daily remembrances is what God did to Miriam on the journey out of Egypt. God struck Miriam with a horrible skin disease, which the Bible calls leprosy, or which English translations call leprosy, which is really something different from what modern leprosy is, but that's not important. The important thing is that Miriam spoke out against Moses' wife, and God struck her with a skin disease, and she had to be separated from people. There's a strong ethical message here, which is typically talked about in terms of lashon hara, evil speech. If you speak evil of people, you will have a kind of sickness that means you need to be separated out from the community. We're called upon at this time of year, I would suggest, to think deeply about this. We are to remember what happened to Miriam because we are having to call upon ourselves to be more forgiving than Miriam was. I'd like someone else to read this last quote from a small but beautiful article by Rabbi Jonathan Shulman on Tshuva and Yom HaZikaron. Ellen, we already heard from you, so I'm hoping somebody else will volunteer to read? I would just like to get more voices in here. Does anybody else, is anybody else willing to volunteer?
I can read, David.
That would be great.
Rabbi Jonathan Schulman, Tshuva and Yom HaZikaron. The Zikaron of something always refers to its essence. Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaZikaron, the day of essence. The essence referred to here is to us, to people. Adam, the first person, was created on Rosh Hashanah. People were created with an essential purpose, a potential to be in the image of God. This is the essence we are asking God to recall on Rosh Hashanah, and that we are remembering in ourselves. The actualization of our lives lies out of balance and off target from our true nature, and we are asking God not to judge us on our actualization, but to see our potential, our essence, and to give us time to right ourselves. The day of Rosh Hashanah is for us to contemplate what this essence is for ourselves and what we believe our true nature is.
So what Jonathan Schulman is getting at there is that one of the meanings of the root of Zecher is the male sex. Zecher in that trilateral root means masculine. And what he says earlier in that article is that the masculine in Israelite and later rabbinic ontology only contributes one small drop to the creation of a person. The feminine provides the nurturing atmosphere that brings that person into the physical world. So Zecher has to do with a drop, an essence, a small particle, a piece, but an essential piece. So we are being asked to return to our essence on this day. I want us to just take 2 minutes now, and for you to grab the pen and paper if you have them, or to use your computer if you can, and engage in a reflective writing exercise with me. What is the essential part of you to which you will do tshuva, to which you will return, beginning on Rosh Hashanah? The 10 days of awe are about realigning yourself and returning to this basic essence. In just a few words, in just 2 minutes, write down the words that come to your mind, and later, go back to those words. Circle them, revise them, but begin this process for 2 minutes. What is the essence of you that you will realign with on this day of remembering? Because this is, for us, one of the essential functions of memory. I will come back to you in 2 minutes. And now, if you would be so kind, and I see some people are already doing this, which is great. If you haven't done this, share with us something that one of these essences to which you want to return. This is a way for you to put it out there, to basically use it as a memorial, to send it into the world. And I'd encourage you to think about reading these words out loud to yourself so you can hear what you have written. It's interesting that many of you are saying the precise things that we are asking God to do, which is wonderful. And it's interesting to note that these are not just profound and wonderful attributes, but these are, I asked you to reflect on essences, and these are things that you all see as essences of yourself. Not just great things to which you would aspire, but in some way you all know that these things are essential to who you are, which I would encourage you in. I think that's fantastic. And in conclusion to this class, I just want to say that next week, when we transition to thinking about how God remembers, we will still be winding in because these are mutual processes. More thoughts about how humanity remembers and how the human and the divine in Torah reflect upon, influence, and help grow each other. The remarkable and one of the most radical ideas in Torah that we come back to at this time of year is that we have the ability to grow and influence ourselves, each other, our community, and our world, and even God. So that if you believe in God, or if you believe in the human capacity to think and remember in ways that can change the world, this is the time of year for you to really take that work seriously and engage in it with a full, open, and forgiving heart. Forgiving not just toward others, but to yourself as well. Whether or not you join me next week, I want to wish you a sweet, healthy, safe, prosperous, growing, continuing, healthful, restorative, rejuvenating year. And if I do see you next week, I will be overjoyed.